Again, thank you for asking us all to come and speak today. So, being involved in transition, now I just want to qualify this. My specific area of interest and maybe a bit of expertise is transition between children's care and adult care. I'm going to mention a little bit about transition into school as well, but I'm no more of an expert on that than anybody is. Specifically, my conflict of interest here is that I was on the NICE guideline development group for transition between paediatric and adult healthcare. I run a transition clinic locally that takes people from everywhere, really. But the reason I got into it is a story that really does leave people silent, but when it got said in a room full of doctors, got met with peals of laughter. And I'm a bit embarrassed, but I'm going to say it because it's important that we all recognise what you've already said today. So somebody I really respected, one of my old bosses, got up at a really, really big international meeting in the States and said, the great thing about being a paediatric urologist is that when you get to 16, you're someone else's problem. I thought, what? And that was the minute I thought, okay, this has got to stop. And that was the minute, actually, I stopped turning up to his clinics, to be honest. But no loss there. I don't think he missed me either. But it is important because these are conditions that are lifelong. And I don't just mean anorectal malformations. A large proportion of my urology practice is spina bifida, which is also lifelong. If we wind the clock back 20 years, spina bifida is a condition that half of people would be dead before they got to 35. And we're not there anymore. We're now survivals into the 5th and 6th decades. So I'm going to talk mainly about transition between paediatric and adult healthcare. But people have thought about transition into school as well, and there was a big public health review specifically to address health inequalities across the country. The lead for the Institute of Health Equity at University College London is Professor Marmont. The Marmont Inquiry in 2010 looked at some of the issues at a social care level, as well as an education level, as well as a healthcare level, that influenced how people did in their lives. And it comes down to a basic level of if you come from a poor background and you have a healthcare need and an educational need, you're not going to live as long, and you're going to be in worse health than you would have been otherwise. And there's this document that's straightforward to read, and there are a few things to think about for our group of patients with anorectal malformations, for all sorts of things. When they start school, we need to know and document what their healthcare needs are and what their follow-up plans are, and we need to have that communicated with the people at school who are going to look after them, the teachers. It needs to be joined up. It's normal for teachers to get a bit cross with young children who just leave to go to the toilet all the time. But if there's a reason to need to do that, the only way you're going to nail it is to have communicated it. If there are special things that children need, if they need appliances, if they need to be in nappies or wear pads, if they need to go and pass a urinary catheter, or to have a urinary catheter passed if you're only 4 or 5. It needs to be documented very clearly in terms of the overall educational need. The thing that used to be called a Statement of Educational Needs is now called an Educational Healthcare or an EHIC plan. And the key to all of this, and that's what the Marmont Inquiry said, is to have good communication and systems put in place that allow children to get the opportunity to have short days to start with, to have an introduction to the school or institution where they're going to go, recognising that if it's done badly, it has a lifelong influence. The that's all I'm going to say specifically about transition into school, but as I said, I'm no more of an expert on that than anybody else is. We know that transition between paediatric and adult healthcare in every single long-term condition is, I think, what my mother would have called a bit of a ropey time. If we think about conditions like kidney failure and transplant, transition between paediatric and adult healthcare is the time you stop taking your anti-rejection medicine. The asthmatics is the time that they get worse. The epileptics is the time that they get worse because they don't adhere to their medicines. The neuropathic bladder conditions, it's the time that the youngsters stop doing their catheters. They get recurrent urinary infections, they get wetter, they get complications because of that. And there are big gaps between paediatric care in conditions like cerebral palsy, ADHD, looked after children who have mental health concerns. There's just a precipice and nothing for them. A bit like you said, you know, earlier on, just you get abandoned. So this was mooted as a suggestion for some guidance from NICE, and it was the first bit of guidance from NICE that encapsulated social care as well as healthcare. And off the back of that, there came some quality standards. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that because I think it's important, because this is out there as guidance, and I think it's reasonable that families can use a list of things that actually we should all be trying to provide. And at a very basic level, it can be used as a lobbying tool for people who commission healthcare. So we'll talk a little bit about that, if that's okay. Paediatric doctors put families at the centre of what they look after, and I think that's completely right. The difference between paediatric care and adult care is that we're meant to be talking about individual patients as being the centre of care for adult health care. And we've got to recognise that actually getting that process to work can be very difficult. Parents don't want to let go. Doctors don't want to let go of their favourite patients. Patients don't want to let go of their favourite doctors. Patients really want to let go of some of their doctors who are least favourite, but generally speaking, it's a time that can cause quite a lot of pain. So what that means really is that this is a process rather than an event in time, and that's one of the big messages of guidance really for transition, is that the whole point about transition is that it starts whenever you want it to start, and the quality standard, as we'll see in a bit, is about year 9. But there's no reason why, with the newborn baby, it's not unreasonable to say, of course, what we're looking at here is the evolution over the entire care package for your children is going to be looking at getting them into adulthood and trying to make things as good as we can possibly get them for them. Notice I didn't use the word independent, and a lot of the literature that's come out about transition with long-term conditions has talked about independence. But there are quite a lot of children who will grow into adults who will have variable amounts of independence. And I see that a lot in my patients with spina bifida, where a lot of them are very heavily dependent on others for care. And one of the big things about the national guidance is that we make things as developmentally appropriate to each individual as we can. Now fine, you may well have a 2-year-old who can do the quadratic formula, that's great. But more often than not you won't, and you need to try and tailor this. We need to try and tailor this to each individual. At least half of the 30, 40-year-olds who come to my adult clinic will bring either an elderly parent with them or somebody who's just nice to them, who'll come with them, who look after them. Another thing that we need, and that is mandated really, is that there is somebody who is designated as a named worker. Now I realise that in some spheres, like in mental health, the term named worker has a slightly different meaning. In terms of transition, this is somebody who's going to act both as an advocate for the youngster and as a little bit of a secretary cum PA cum pal. It's somebody who understands when appointments are going to be, understands when bits of treatment are going to change, somebody who can be a point of contact. There needs to be a bit of documentation and a plan for transition, and there are lots of these around, but one that's, I suppose, most popular in the UK at the moment is Ready, Steady, Go. Has anybody heard or used Ready, Steady, Go at all? Yeah, okay, well, okay. So this is basically a package of questionnaires aimed at the youngster and their family, asking them what they understand about their condition, asking them about how they understand their treatment, what medicines are they on, what questions do you need to be asking for next time. And it's one of those red, amber, green things that you're not quite ready to go, you're getting ready to go, and now you're ready to transfer. So transition's a process, transfer is a discrete time point. And it's useful for each individual to have just a bit of a summary of their healthcare needs, and we've called it a one-page summary. It doesn't have to be a page if it doesn't have to be a page, but it needs to be a summary of what's going on. Something that somebody can take with them and is transferable and they can easily use to refer. So if someone goes to university at the other end of the country, they need to have a summary of their condition that helps along with their understanding of it. So down to the level of each individual, we've got to try and get engagement, and that's one of the hardest things. This is why people stop taking their anti-rejection medicines, this is why people stop catheterizing, this is why people stop taking their laxatives, this is why people's diets go bad, is getting them to engage in what they need to do. We recognise that young brains are fundamentally different to middle-aged brains, and brain development carries on well into the teens and early 20s. And that's, again, they get very symptomatic, they wet a lot, they get a lot of fecal leakage. I can think of a number of patients with cloaca I look after in early adulthood who really struggle, and getting the engagement to come to follow-up appointments. And that's part of the job of the named worker, to be able to do that. It's really isolating. I've heard that a few times today, how isolated this is. I am so lonely because I'm the only person who's got this condition. And just to go some way towards recognising that can be very helpful. Because actually, at the end of the day, everybody tries to be a team. This particular slide I put up for two reasons. One is because this is all meant to be teamwork, and it is a privilege to be part of a team. But also the NICE guidance is very clear that there has to be somebody both with clinical responsibility for matters of healthcare, but also for managerial responsibility. You know, that's a bit of an oxymoron often, managerial responsibility in healthcare. But it's mandated, there has to be somebody to look after the nitty-gritty, the finances, the bottom line of transition processes. And I think that's a good lobbying point for people to hold up, really. If there isn't somebody with managerial responsibility, there should be. I talked a little bit about gaps that exist between children's healthcare and between adult healthcare, and the two big ones that we recognised during development of the guidance was in cerebral palsy and in mental health services. But actually, even at a very basic level, finding a gynecologist who understands the problems of duplication of the vagina and the uterus in cloaca, or finding a urologist who understands about the neuropathic conditions that you can have with anorectal malformations can be difficult enough, and those are gaps in the service. And then there's actually working out what we need to measure. And for the third time today, I'm going to mention Donald Rumsfeld and his unknown unknowns. And it's something that Jonathan and I have talked about a lot over the years, is trying to make the important measurable rather than making the measurable important. So this is something to perhaps put down on your lobbying placard for transition. There needs to be a plan in place by year 9. And the reason year 9 was picked was to fall into line with legislation for the education and healthcare plans. It's mandated by legislation that you've got to have a transition plan from year 9. Now obviously there are some conditions, not anorectal malformations, but there are some conditions that don't turn up until you're 15 or 16, and it's obvious that you can't have a plan in place by year 9 then, but what it really means is year 9 or as soon as possible after that. There needs to be a documented annual meeting just to review how transition planning is going. It doesn't have to be a formal meeting with a load of people around a boardroom table, but at least a plan has to be thought of and documented. We talked about the need for a named worker, and it's also mandated in guidance that you have to be able to meet your adult practitioner before you transfer. And then to have strategies for non-engagement. There are a number of hospital institutions that have a non-attendance policy, and there are some places where if you don't attend your first appointment, you won't get sent for again. And the last guidance does say that we shouldn't really be doing that with long-term conditions. Now, what the quality standards don't mention in terms of need-to-dos is the importance of a GP. And we all recognise that just talking about communication, a GP needs to be involved in all of these plans, although not necessarily in the room at the time, but they obviously need to be kept in the loop, because your GP is going to be your GP if you've got the same GP, whether or not you're 2, 22 or 102. So I'm just going to move on now in the last 5 minutes or so, just to talk about some specific long-term things that came up partly in the questions from the group, and also issues that we come across with anorectal malformations in adulthood. And to start with, fertility and sexual function. Part of the problem being able to stand and say anything is that a lot of what's published is very anecdotal. And to go back to the Finnish paper, the Helsinki paper, although the range in age was up to 29 years old, the average length of follow-up was still only 12 years, so everyone's still just got their anecdotes to say. The theme, though, that comes out is that the level of the malformation, again, is quite an important indicator of erectile function, of sexual function overall, and of fertility. Now, obviously, there are some specific things to talk about as well. If you have duplication or absence of the vagina, that's going to have its own fertility implications. An abnormal vagina or uterus is going to mean you're more at risk of miscarriage or more at risk of preterm birth. If we talk about pregnancy and childbirth, obviously we recognise that girls born with anorectal malformations are able to have babies. One of the questions is, how do we deliver babies? Now, we know from the anecdotes that vaginal delivery certainly is possible. And this is one of the things where I'm now going to tell you what I think rather than what I can prove by evidence. But I think that if you've had your perineal body or your vagina operated on, I think it would be very risky to have a vaginal delivery. I'm not saying it's impossible, but I think it would be very risky, and that's what we're recommending to the women that we see. And indeed to the families and the girls as they're coming through. The one thing that we do have now quite a lot of experience is if you've had a lot of reconstruction surgery in your abdomen, we really would recommend caesarean delivery. Why? Well, if you've had multiple laparotomies, or you've had a bladder augmentation, or you've got a catheterizable ACE, or you've got a metrophenol to catheterize the bladder, there would have been quite a lot of rearrangement of the insides. And if you're an obstetrician or a midwife dealing with an obstructed delivery, normally the process would be to go on and have an emergency caesarean section. The problem with an emergency caesarean section is that they're very often done at 2:45 in the morning. They're often done by obstetricians who are relatively inexperienced, and I don't mean that in a bad way, because I'm a completely inexperienced obstetrician. I did my 5 vaginal deliveries as a medical student and got them ticked off. But what you don't want is an obstetrician doing an operation through a multiply operated abdomen and causing harm to things that have been done before. So what we do in Nottingham is that every single woman who's multiply operated, particularly with bladder reconstructions, is that we go and do the caesarean sections. And we do them with the obstetricians. But we found that to be a very safe way of doing things electively, so it's all planned. It's going to be a planned caesarean section at 37, 38 weeks, done with one of 2 urologists, and I'm one of them, and a consultant obstetrician, done at 11 o'clock in the morning when everybody's nice and fresh and bright in a planned way with an otherwise healthy woman. And that avoids the need for emergency episiotomy. And of course, if you've got a reconstructed perineum and an emergency episiotomy, you don't know what disaster awaits you. I want to talk a little bit about ACE stomas, because ACE stomas seem to work very well in children. And when we all came through paediatric surgery school, we learned to do lots and lots of ACE procedures. As is often the way in surgery, there's often a lot of enthusiasm for a particular thing, and it's applied to a whole gamut of things before eventually we hone down on really where it's good and where it's perhaps not quite so good. And then a few reports started to come out about how ACEs had a late, I'm going to call it failure, because that's what the paper from Liverpool called it, a late failure rate, and up to half of the young adults had given up on their ACEs, and that's my experience with ACEs in the adult population. But that's ACEs for all reasons: anorectal malformations, patients with spina bifida, that they just stop using them, and we've taken down in our series more than 50% of the ACEs that were made in childhood. This is looking at surveillance, because we don't know what's going to happen 30 years after you've had disconnection of a rectourethral fistula. Is there a possible risk of there being some of the intestinal mucosa left at the back of the bladder or the back of the urethra? We don't really know. A lot of this in my world comes from surveillance of people who've had bladder augmentation operations, because we tell people that there's an increased risk of getting cancer in the bladder augment. Now, it does seem to be very rare. I think that's a reassuring thing. We really don't see very much of it at all. But it's how best to be able to survey these. And really what this is referring to is just the importance of long-term follow-up. And as I said in a slide in my talk about urology, when we're thinking about the urinary system, we're looking at ways of surveying the kidneys to make sure the kidney function's okay, ways to survey the bladder itself, how well it's emptying. And the same goes for really all aspects of function. We recognise in people who've got spinal problems that there is a later incidence of neurological deterioration in bladder and bowel and limbs. And it seems to be something that goes off over many years. But we're only recently, since people have been living longer with this, started to recognise the phenomenon of deterioration of the spine. Not all of this is bad news though, because I think our generation of paediatric doctors is tuned into the fact that lifelong conditions need lifelong follow-up. And you're not fixed and fixed once. You're fixed as well as we can do, but there's an ongoing process of trying to see if we can fix anything else as well. We're doing better and better since there's been NICE guidance, and I just want to end on the slide you've already seen. We are doing it better than the Americans are.
So this is now it's question and answer time for